Released in March of 2015, Bot the movie is a perfect storm of fear-mongering pseudoscience that utilizes the plight and suffering of real family tragedies to push a narrative of suspicion and conspiracy. It is the intent of this video series to illustrate the glaring errors and pseudoscientific claims made by the people involved in this movie, and to expose the dangerous rhetoric that is espoused by the creators and the people that they have brought on as experts. Hello, and welcome back to my episodic movie review of Bot. In the previous episode, we established the key players, the experts, if you will. I figure now would be a good time to tackle the claims that are actually made inside this movie. By and large, the two main topics that they focus on in this movie is GMOs and vaccines. And because I want to make sure we address every single aspect of their claims in order, we're probably going to have to split it up over multiple different episodes. Today we're talking about vaccines, and holy shit, does this film make some outright bold and completely bullshit claims. To recap, this is what the main interviewer Tony Bark says at the beginning of the film.
We didn't used to see chronic, debilitating diseases in children until recently. And so we know that it's something we've done.
And I got into this in the very first episode, expressing how we've had childhood ailments for years. But just to recap a little bit, let's do a brief history on vaccines. As early as the 11th century in China, we have accounts of people inoculating themselves against smallpox. However, these antiquated accounts are generally regarded as having nothing to do with the modern development of vaccines. Instead, after untold millions and millions of deaths from smallpox, the search was on to try and find some sort of answer to the problem. The first major breakthrough was in 1796 with a doctor named Edward Jenner, and he successfully managed to inoculate a young boy from smallpox by using cowpox, which is in the same basic family of the orthopox family of viruses. And this generally works because cowpox in and of itself is a much more milder form than human-induced smallpox. So when the young boy recovered, he had the necessary antibodies, the necessary immunity to smallpox so that he was no longer at risk from contracting it and quite possibly dying. The idea of introducing a weaker form of a virus for inoculations has been successfully used for measles, rubella, smallpox, and several more throughout decades and decades and decades, and the statistical data is very, very clear. We'll revisit this as we continue.
So Porter is the second of my 4 kids, born totally healthy, and when he was 4 months old, he went in for the typical well baby checkup, had a spate of vaccines. We were awoken at about 11 o'clock at night by the worst high-pitched scream I've ever heard. And it was one of those experiences where you've never heard this sound before and you know something is just horribly wrong.
The first case we're introduced to is Porter Bridges, and his mother, Sarah, is a psychologist. Please note the clever rebranding of neuropsychologist, and she tells the story of her son succumbing to a fever and becoming severely disabled. This is Sarah explaining his diagnosis.
His diagnosis is brain injury from the pertussis vaccine. He also has psychiatric diagnoses. He's autistic. He has mental retardation. It's kind of a death without an actual death.
Now, there are some very carefully chosen conditions that were put into there. A vaccine injury from the pertussis vaccine, which led to autism, mental retardation, etc., etc., etc. But she also mentions that he has persistent seizures, but nowhere in the diagnosis do they mention that he has epilepsy. Now, that isn't to say that the child was not harmed by a vaccine, because vaccine injuries do happen. They can happen, but they are extremely, extremely rare. Moreover, epilepsy, febrile seizures, and many other things can easily cause severe amounts of brain damage, especially in a young child. That this is framed in such a way that her son contracted brain damage, autism, and seizures, but doesn't mention anywhere that he's epileptic, makes it kind of suspicious.
There were enormous bills running up throughout this process because Porter was in physical therapy, occupational therapy, on special diets, having special transportation. He was admitted to the hospital 12 times in 1 year, constantly in the ambulance, meds for this. All of that kind of payment, much of which isn't covered even by insurance, we were paying for.
And this is another suspicious part. At no point did they mention that Sarah is a psychologist for business coaching. We're told about the immense cost that it takes for her to raise her son, but they also fail to mention that she worked for a Fortune 1000 company. There is a massive difference between the actual costs of a normal working family and having to deal with an autistic child as compared to the things that Sarah said she employed. And the notion that all of these extra programs that she threw into there and jacking up the actual cost, as she cites, it takes to take care of her son, to what it would cost for a working class family is extremely disingenuous. Next, we get into a little thing about the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which was started in the 1980s. Now, the filmmakers selectively forget to mention that the whole reason why that program was established in the first place is because the influx of lawsuits were threatening to possibly create a vaccine shortage, in which case all of those easily preventable diseases would have to have a resurgence. As such, they created the program to kind of streamline the whole system of dealing with people filing lawsuits. And why was there so many lawsuits? Because of radical, baseless hysteria. And then we get this incredible quote from Mary Holland. And the film lists her as a researcher, but her research is purely in law. She's not a scientist, she's not a biologist. But, yeah, just take a listen to this gem.
And 90% of the cases have to go through a causation process. They have to prove that the injury that the child or the adult suffered was due to the vaccine.
Well, yes, Mary, if you want to prove to a court that a vaccine injured your child, you have to be able to prove that the vaccine harmed your child. That kind of stands to reason, don't you think?
There's very little science, so proving causation is extremely difficult.
Oh, actually, there's plenty of science. Now, there's a reason why the Bridges case is put in the very front of the movie, and that's because they won. They won their court case. And so, in this way, it lends a whole lot of credibility to the whole basis from which the film is going to build off of from there. And this very affluent, very rich family, this mother who, I'm not saying she's not had a rough time having to raise her son, but no longer has to pay for her own childcare. It's a way to show absolute guilt on the part of vaccines. But as I noted previously, there is a lot more nuance to the injury that her son suffered, not the least of which is the very simple and basic fact that vaccines don't cause autism. They just don't. And if the board ruled in their favor, it wasn't because of autism, it was because they found that the vaccine could have, quite possibly, caused these other damages to him.
Let's concentrate on something that's neutral to start with, which is vaccine safety. People getting educated about their health, the vaccines being made as safe as possible. And then when and if the horrible, unfortunate thing happens, that kids have a side effect, then let's take care of those kids.
That's just it. We do. That's literally why we have this system in place. Literally the point. The sad state of affairs is that biomedical research isn't completely perfect. And there are cases where children have genetic markers that can lead them to having sorts of injuries due to complications with vaccines. But none of those are autism. None of those are autism. In fact, you have only a 0.003% chance that you will have any adverse reaction whatsoever of any significance from a vaccine. And that's not even going into the realm of severe reactions. This is just anything of note. And currently, as we speak right now, researchers are looking into making tailored vaccines using various basic types of genetic sequencing so that even those children who otherwise would have a negative reaction, we can tailor the medication itself so that these children can still be protected, which is amazing.
Well, I think as a mother, if you look at what's happening objectively, you can't be denied that these illnesses are on the rise. And the scientific community officially doesn't have any answers for us.
The only confirmed cases of any diseases being on the rise are those who are easily preventable by vaccines, and those are only rising because the vaccine rates are dropping. And why? Anti-vax hysteria. But let's just address the elephant in the room. Autism. Now, the reason why we've had a huge increase in autism isn't because there are more autistic people. Instead, we have changed in the DSM how we classify autism. It's now a spectrum. So whereas before, profound autism, what we know now as profound autism, used to be the only type of autism. Nonverbal, usually having very few social skills, certain types of impulses, etc., etc. But these days, because we've widened it into such a spectrum, there are perfectly functional human beings who have autism, and they are now counted in those numbers. So whereas before, you'd have this rarity of autism, now it's much more prevalent because it's not actually classifying the same thing. It's classifying more things. See how that works?
We look to pediatricians, and the first time I questioned the safety of certain vaccines, the mood in the room changed so much. I didn't know that it would spark such a strong reaction from my peers and people who know me and love me, and people who I know and love.
Probably because your unfounded ideas quite literally put your children and other children who cannot be vaccinated at risk.
As a mom, I just want what's best for my kids, and I'm not afraid to question.
Of course you can question. Anybody can question. But the fact remains, if you're trusting anonymous people on the internet, or somebody who's trying to sell you homeopathic cures, then your impaired judgment, your impaired questioning, is going to put your child at risk.
I know that you're handling a case that does have to do with a very large drug company.
This is the case that we have brought on behalf of 2 whistleblowers who used to work at Merck. They were testing the efficacy of the mumps vaccine. They weren't getting the efficacy for which they were originally given approval.
Now, we won't focus on this too much because the court case is still pending, but whatever controversies are surrounding Merck, their mumps vaccine has absolutely and confirmed reduced the incidences of mumps by 98%. That's a lot.
It wasn't until later in my career that I began asking questions. I saw 3 patients brought into the hospital with acute kidney failure. I mean, they weren't making urine and they required immediate dialysis. And they had just weeks to months before had perfectly normal kidney function. 2 out of 3 of them volunteered to me that I was fine until I had that vaccine.
So your evidence is 2 people said they were fine before they got vaccinated. Wow, much science. So impressed.
I talked to the administration of the hospital because I thought they would want to know about this. But instead of wanting to know, they actively, rapidly refuted any potential correlation between the vaccine and the kidney failure.
Well, yes, because you don't make broad proclamations because 2 random people reported a slightly similar result. That doesn't make any sense. So next we have the case of Charlie Wilbur, and I'll let his family explain.
We had a neighbor whose child was exactly the same age as Charlie, so we could watch and kind of compare and say, wait, you know, they're already saying X, Y, and Z, and they're starting to ride a bike or whatever.
Yeah, waving bye-bye and pointing at stuff that I wanted.
You know, I want that, but now it would just go, he wouldn't do anything, he would just scream.
These types of cases break my heart. Autism on the level that Charlie has is a profoundly life-changing and difficult thing for any family to deal with. However, there's a problem.
If you were having another baby now, what would you do?
I would consider vaccination on a different path, a different time frame, if we decide to do it. And if there's tests to see if the child even needed that vaccination. Following the blind CDC schedule or my physician's recommendation, no way.
Vaccines don't cause autism. That's it. It's as simple as that. There's no argument into this. There is absolutely no component by which anybody can actually prove that autism is caused by vaccines. In fact, we have every reason to know that it doesn't. Copious and copious and copious amounts of research and study has been put into this. There's no question anymore. Vaccines don't cause autism. I personally worked for years with a man who was severely, profoundly autistic, and he was never vaccinated. His mom was a hippie. They lived in the woods. He ate nothing but organic and grown garden vegetables, etc., etc., etc. But if for some reason my simple anecdotal basis for saying that vaccines don't cause autism, well, I have a plethora of information for you, and it's all in the description box below. Next, we have the DeLong Rose family, and I previously mentioned in episode 2, Gail has a huge conflict of interest. But not only that, she's grossly unqualified to make any bold claims about vaccines.
Let's be very clear, I'm not saying that vaccines cause autism. I'm saying there's an association with getting fully vaccinated and developing autism. It's an epidemiological study. It doesn't prove anything. We need to have the vaccinated versus unvaccinated study if we want real proof. And that study has never been done, by the way.
You know, it's pretty interesting that you say that because actually there has been a study. And the study involved over 95,000 children. And it showed no link between vaccines and autism. Sorry.
I would like to see research that our kids need. I would like to see that the link between vaccines and autism is not a closed question. It's a very much open question. And once we approach autism as a vaccine injury, then our treatments for those kids are totally different.
But it's not a vaccine injury, so no, we won't. So anyway, up next is Barbara Loe Fisher, who we've already discussed as a complete loony bird. But let's check out the stats that the filmmakers put up while she speaks.
When my children were being vaccinated in the late 70s and 80s, there were only 23 doses of 7 vaccines. Today, the CDC recommends 69 doses of 16 vaccines, starting on the day of birth at 12 hours of age through age 18. 49 doses of those vaccines are given before the age of 6. This is a very, very different experience. Their immune systems are developing in a very different way. At the same time, we've tripled the numbers of doses of vaccines. We have seen this increase in chronic immune and brain dysfunction. You cannot take off the table the potential connection between atypically manipulating the immune system over and over again with the use of multiple vaccines in the early developmental period and this chronic disease and disability epidemic.
Well, that's interesting, an inference that somehow vaccines are related to diabetes, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The levels for increase in type 2 diabetes have actually leveled off at this point, which again would not make a whole lot of sense if you were trying to relate it to vaccines. But moreover, diabetes is much more likely to affect girls, whereas boys are more likely to contract autism. So what's the answer? Well, that's easy. We know why kids have an increased risk of diabetes. Weight gain. Next we have the claim that asthma has been on the rise, and it's true, asthma was on the rise. But then it leveled out, and it's actually started to drop lately. Asthma is quite commonly attributed to environmental factors, and also to obesity. There is not one shred of evidence linking it to vaccines. None. The third one is learning disabilities, and this is such a nebulous and broad topic that there's really not a whole lot of way to quantify it. But I will say, after spending a few hours trying to find any results on this whatsoever, I came up with nothing. Absolutely nothing. Many people theorize that one of the reasons why children have learning disabilities is because we have access to information so much more quickly now, which leads to shorter attention spans. Because we still teach in an old way, children sometimes tend to suffer because of it, and they can't learn as well in school. And given it's such a broad thing, it's hard to nail anything concrete down, which actually helps their argument in this case. Because as long as there's wiggle room to try and make the case, they're definitely going to try and make it. Next, we have the conspiracy theorist and computer programmer Stephanie Seneff, who claims,
if you project from the growth of autism over the last 6 years, you can figure that about half the kids are going to have autism by the quarter-century mark. We're not going to be able to do much else besides take care of those kids.
Her entire argument comes from what some of us call dumpster diving, which is going through the VAERS database, or we'll call it VAERS database, to find any incidents of damage caused by vaccines. But the problem with this is that the VAERS database is not moderated. It's an open dump where anybody can just make a basic claim. But there are plenty of times where people will routinely go through the VAERS database and they'll pick out which ones have actually been substantiated. And I bet you can guess how many are. It's a very, very small percentage. You see, the problem with Stephanie Seneff is she does her entire shtick by comparing two different data sets to try and find a correlative cause. This is not fucking science. For instance, here's a chart that shows Nicolas Cage movies have an influence on drowning deaths. Oh, and hey, how about this one? It appears the decrease in consumption of margarine means a decrease in divorces in the state of Maine. Amazing!
Many factions of the government say it's a genetic epidemic. I know, and I find that very frustrating because they're spending so much money. Even here at MIT, a lot of money is being spent on the genetic aspects of autism, looking for the genes that might be causing autism. But it's the environmental triggers that actually cause the genes to mutate. In the context of this environment, that gene isn't working properly.
While the science is still out on what causes autism, we still understand some basic prevailing conditions or factors. For instance, when we started studying twins with autism as related to their siblings and what their environmental factors could possibly be, we now know that absolutely the vast majority of mechanisms that cause or induce autism have to be genetic. Also, I have to say, this woman has no understanding whatsoever of genetics. It's awful. We'll continue decompiling these ridiculous vaccine myths in the next episode.